While retirement is generally seen as a time of relaxation and self-focus, God calls us to love, serve, and help others for a lifetime. He has been preparing us for this retirement season literally our entire lives. In retirement, countless Christians enter a state of spiritual dormancy, not knowing how they are called to have an impact for God's kingdom. The Retirement Reformation seeks to encourage and empower the 50 million Christians approaching or in retirement to embrace the calling God has been preparing in them. When the world says it's time to stop, you can begin to have your greatest impact. Welcome to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, where our goal is to journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him.
Reaching out to the 50 million Christ followers in America who are already in retirement or on their way to retirement, you've tuned into iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I'm joined, as always, by Bruce Bruinsma, the founder of the Retirement Reformation. Please check us out online, retirementreformation.org, retirementreformation.org, and we invite you to click on the manifesto when you get on the website. We'd love for you to sign the manifesto. In fact, that's what we're talking about today. The Retirement Reformation is committed to encouraging a movement where every Christ follower is confident in God's plan for a lifetime of faithful service and committed to helping the body of Christ reform its understanding of retirement. And boy, do we need that. Then bearing fruit without measure throughout the remainder of our lives. We assert the biblical truth that Jesus followers are called to bear fruit in every season of life and affirm the commitment to the 10 principles of the Retirement Reformation Manifesto. Bruce Bruinsma is here to talk about that Retirement Reformation Manifesto and principle number 1 of the manifesto, which is freedom. Bruce Bruinsma, welcome back to iRetire4Him.
Thanks, Jim. Good to be back. And I'm so excited that we're in this series about the Retirement Reformation Manifesto. In our prior podcast, we talked a little bit about its history and how God led it to be formed and how it's so foundational and important, not only for introducing the idea of the Retirement Reformation Manifesto and the changed thinking that it challenges us to, not only introducing that to those who have never thought about it before or never heard of it before or never even wondered what it might even be about, but then to be able to work our way through each one of the 10 principles. And it was fascinating as God led 16 of us as we were together in 2.5 days of prayer and reflection, and out of that coming the language of the Retirement Reformation Manifesto and those 10 principles. It was fascinating to me to see how he guided us to structure the sequence of those principles. And that the very first principle that he had us land on was the one that we're talking about today, which is freedom. And the challenge that we have then is to live for more than our culture's definition and expectation of retirement, to live for more than that. And when we live for more than that, then that leads us to reforming our thinking, changing what we do, how we interact, how we live. And the result is freedom in its multiple manifestations.
Well, and let's just read what this first principle is. I mean, you just stated it, but let's just read what the first principle of the Retirement Reformation Manifesto says. It says, freedom. We live for more than our culture's definition and expectations of retirement. Reforming retirement requires a reframing of our thinking, allowing us to shine a light into the purposeless retirement void and finding freedom from unending leisure, indulgence, and self-gratification. Bruce, there's a lot of people out there that are going, I kind of like unending freedom, and I like unending leisure and indulgence and self-gratification. At least for a little bit. When they retire, they're thinking when they retire that this is all there is.
Not only are they thinking that's all there is, but then they continue to live out as if that's all there is. And one of the strange things that the way God has formed us is that when there isn't meaning and purpose, the grass looks greener on the side of leisure and self-gratification, because after all, we're all very selfish individuals. And yet the way God made us is that we get the greatest joy when in fact we step out of ourselves into his calling on our life. And it's almost like an oxymoron. You'd think that freedom means nothing. And yet nothing is the worst place that you could be, because you are trapped by that very idea, that very reality of nothing. I'll just give you one quick example. Judy and I were just so blessed for over the recent holidays. For 5 days, we went up to a cabin up in the southern part of Colorado. It sits on top of a hill on 35 acres, beautiful cabin, looks out at the Santa Cristo Range, mountains. I mean, it was just absolutely gorgeous. And we were going to go for a couple of days. And I said, let's extend that a little bit. So we went actually for 5 days. By the end of that 5 days, and we had a wonderful time. It was fantastic. We did nothing, and we really did it well. However, Sunday afternoon, when we packed up and ready to go, and we're about halfway on the 2 hours it takes to get back to Colorado Springs, I was already thinking with anticipation about what was going to happen that next day, what ministry was going to take place, the conversations that we're having today. And I was excited about what was coming. I was pleased, energized, relaxed by doing nothing for 5 days. But if that had continued for another year or 5 years or 10 years, man, just, put me down and shoot me. It would be just terrible. And so freedom takes on some really interesting characteristics that don't necessarily mean nothing, nor are they 100% dealing with leisure and self-gratification, but carrying out what God's plan for us is.
But you word it so interestingly in this manifesto principle to help them find freedom from unending leisure. When somebody experiences unending leisure, what happens to them, Bruce?
What happens is that if you think about the last time that you bought an orange, and you had the orange in the vegetable part of your refrigerator, and somehow it got stuck in the back right-hand corner, and you just didn't see it. So now 6 months have gone by, and you pull some stuff out, and you go, oh my goodness, look at that. Oh, gee whiz. It's shriveled, and you just, you go, oh my gosh, that thing is terrible. That's a version of what happens to us when we have unending leisure and and there is nothing that guides us. And we become inward looking, we become shriveled, we become old, and we lack value to ourselves or to anyone else. All you can do with that silly orange is get it out of there, go, oh my gosh, that's ugly, and pitch it out. So there's a picture at any rate of what happens when we are stuck in nothing.
It's the whole idea that you stated in last week's podcast, that the value of meaning in our own lives is found in the bearing of fruit itself. And you can't bear fruit when all you're doing is on leisure all the time. Hey, we'll be right back with more with Bruce Bruinsma and the Retirement Reformation on I Retire for Him. But first, we're going to have a conversation next with Leona Bergstrom. So hang tight.
There is a move of God in our country called the Retirement Reformation. It's not enough to sit in the grandstands of life, watching the days go by with leisure as a reward. Join us back on the playing field of life, discovering God's plan for you and building purpose and intentionality into every day. Go to retirementreformation.org and click on the Resources tab. Check out our prayer walk and start ministering to your neighbors through prayer today. Connect with your ongoing journey by downloading the prayer app at retirementreformation.org. Click on the Resources tab. Make the journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Now let's get back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation, as we're doing our manifesto series. And we've got always, during our middle section of our podcast, Bruce, you always invite some guests on to just share their stories from retirement and really just enlighten us. Hey, here's what they're doing with their retirement years, because they understand that they've moved from retirement to reformation. Bruce Bruinsma, who do you have for us today?
Well, today we have let me see. I have a technical problem now. Is it the better half or the other half? At any rate, Leanna Bergstrom, she and her husband Richard have been, friends for a long time, friends in ministry, and we have actually traveled the world talking about the topics that we're going to talk about today. So one more time, Leona, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks, Bruce.
And in last week's segment, when we were talking with Richard, we talked a little bit about, some of your ministry and some of the work that you've done, and your book, The Third Calling, which has been so impactful, and the seminars and so on. I'd like for you and I to have a little conversation today about, because when we think about retirement, we talk about the boomers who are often just kind of entering, or the groups that are just entering into the transition of retirement. I'd like to have a little bit of conversation with you and I today about the stages that go after the initial entry. So now people have made an entry into it, whether they recognize that there's lack of meaning and purpose, or they think they have some. And now we're moving into that second stage where mentoring and so on starts to take place. And then I know that you and Richard's mothers are still alive. They're in the 90s. So you've got real life experiences that are going on there. And I'd like to talk just about those transitions a little bit more. So what are you seeing, and what have you experienced in working with people in your ministry who are now perhaps in their, maybe right after the real active stage, so late 70s, going into their 80s, to find meaning and purpose in that category also?
Richard touched on the fact that we redefine ourselves through many different stages and many different, as you call, seasons of our lives. Of course, when you first retire, if you retire, or if you partially retire, it's pretty euphoric. I mean, you get to go play golf every day if you wanted to. I know some people have said, I wake up and every day is Saturday. It's just wonderful. I get to do all these things I had hoped for. But then we have experienced with many of the people we've worked with, reality sets in that this is not fulfilling, not just because there's not enough to keep me busy, but I'm not giving back. And there's a vacuum in our lives. Especially, and I think you'll appreciate this, Bruce, I love the word stewardship, because it's not just about our finances, but it's about our lives. And God has called us to live for Him our entire lifetime. In fact, our ministry, we used to call it Lifetime. We changed it to Reignite later on. But how do we serve Him our entire lifetime, whatever season we're in? So you touch on the years of mid 70s, early 80s, whatever. There still can be, of course, health and circumstances change all this for different people, but it's still a time of productivity. We can still give back. We still find what our purpose is. And if we don't, they're very non-fulfilling, non-productive years. So our goal is to help people understand that God's designed them uniquely, has put them wherever they are for a purpose, and to find that and live it out. And there's probably two parts of it: grow and serve. Keep growing in your spiritual life, in your personal life, in your family life, but always serve. And that's what's going to give you productivity. Now, when you talk about the more frail years, it's more difficult because people don't know, if they're not doing something, do I have purpose and meaning? My professional career was more with that age group, with the frail elders that were vulnerable both to health disaster and financial disaster, anything. So realizing God's called us for a lifetime is critical, no matter what season we're in.
Well, I think the phrase that I like to use is to be faithful for a lifetime. Mm-hmm. Now, that faithfulness and that faithful walk takes different stages at different times. And so I think one of the areas that we have a lot of work to do, frankly, is to be able to help visualize, conceptualize, and then lay out what kinds of options there are for those that are in that frail area. You've heard, I'm sure, my story, and I think the story of Pam in Tucson, who, 93, and every morning she picks up the phone book and dials the next number and says, "I'm praying for you, and how may I pray for you?" Well, she's an invalid for all practical purposes, and yet she can bring value because of her experiences. And I'm not sure that we have all, as a group, even developed enough ways to be able to suggest options and alternatives that even in a frail state, where they can have that opportunity to reflect on their life and to be able to share that with the younger people. I mean, one of the things for the Retirement Reformation is the transfer of knowledge. We've got the transfer of money from one generation to another. Now we've got to have the transfer of knowledge from one to the other. And, you'll never have more knowledge than you are when you're 90 or 95. Can you speak to that in any way that perhaps will help us to move forward in that conversation?
There's two parts to my answer. One is I agree that we need to help people continue to give back and mentor and pray, no matter what age we are, but particularly our elders, who we desperately need their prayers and support. We have an older woman in our lives who chose to live in a non-Christian retirement community, assisted living, so she could be a witness to others around her. So yes, we must help people see creatively ways they can continue to serve, mentor, and care for the next generations.
And part of that is also I think, an answer to the cultural direction of devaluing older age rather than valuing it.
Sure. And we have to create avenues for people to be able to mentor and care for the next generation. But I also think in our final years of life, we must honor that as sacred ground and allow people to do the very important work of integrating experiences of their lives with what is next in eternity. And to let people really find the wisdom in that and the grace in that and the faith that somehow I go from this life to eternity, and how do I prepare my soul for that? And I've always told my employees that work with vulnerable elders, you are on sacred ground. This is hard work. This is important work to prepare our lives for eternity with the Lord. So it's both and. Yes, how do we help people serve? But how do we help them really be ready on the threshold of heaven? We had some friends in Florida, of all places, who said, well, we're just sitting here in God's waiting room, waiting to go in. And we went, well, wait a minute. What happens in the waiting room? Let us help you think through those issues of both giving back and reflecting.
Lots of work to be done there. Wow. Leona Bergstrom, Richard Bergstrom, thank you guys for joining us these last couple of weeks, sharing your stories. Bruce, you always bring on fantastic guests. If you guys really are interested, listening to this podcast, say you're interested in signing the manifesto, we just ask that you go out to retirementreformation.com, retirementreformation.org/manifesto, retirementreformation.org/manifesto. Sign the manifesto, join thousands who are moving from retirement to reformation. Richard and Leona, thank you again for being on iRetire4Him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back.
You've spent decades making financial plans for your retirement years. But have you done any life planning? God has a plan for your life, and it includes living out your faith in your retirement years with meaning, purpose, and intentionality. Go out to retirementreformation.org and click on our Resources tab. Download a copy of the book, Charting Your Course, and get started with life planning today. Simply download a copy of Charting Your Course at retirementreformation.org. Make the journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Now let's get back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to I Retire for Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. Bruce, that conversation with Leona was a lot of fun. You could just tell how passionate she is about retirement and about the reality that there's so much purpose left in her retirement. She had that sly look at her face like, Bruce, seriously, I get this, and she wanted to share that. And I love the fact that she and her husband Richard are helping others to understand all that. Today, Bruce, we're talking about the Retirement Reformation Manifesto, principle number 1, which is freedom. And I'll remind our listeners that freedom is defined by we live for more than our culture's definition and expectations of retirement. Reforming retirement requires a reframing of our thinking, allowing us to shine a light into the purposelessness of retirement, a purposeless retirement void, and finding freedom from unending leisure, indulgence, and self-gratification. Bruce, why is it that we need to get freedom from, you talked about unending leisure. Why is it we need freedom from indulgence and self-gratification too?
Again, that whole issue, Jim, of in our humanness, how in that circumstance, how we continue to turn inward. And as we continue to turn inward, we shrink and shrivel like that orange I talked about in the last segment. One of the things that is so important is when we're finding freedom, and I wrote a short book about that, which is available online also, that may be of help to people, but we are pretty good about understanding the freedom that we're finding from what we are used to be doing. We are terrible about finding the freedom that God is calling us to and finding that freedom from that unending leisure that you talked about. And so finding freedom too means that we have the ability to respond to God's call. As we respond to God's call, the other issues that we'll talk about in the manifesto come into play, but the ability to be able to make choices and respond to God's call in our lives gives us a sense of freedom. It's that picture we see on TV in some of the ads, where someone is jumping up and their arms in the air and they're yelling, freedom, freedom. I always wonder, they're excited and they're happy and they're feeling good about it. But what's next? What's next as a result of the freedom? And it's just, it's like in our country. The saying is, freedom isn't free. It takes intentionality. It takes action. But then with that freedom, man, we have the flexibility to respond to the needs of others, needs of our family, needs of our community, needs of our country, and to then bring the life that Jesus challenged us to lead,
right.
To bring that to others.
Well, and isn't it true, Bruce, when we are so self-focused, which is what unending leisure leads to, what indulgence leads to, which is what self-gratification leads to, when we are so focused on those things, it's depressing. And that we find a lot of retired folks get depressed because their life is so full of meaninglessness. But yet when they go out to serve others, all of a sudden that depression lifts. I mean, they find purpose. Yet, Bruce, I imagine you're getting pushback from the culture on this, that people are not excited that you're trying to push a manifesto, which we encourage people to go out to retirementreformation.org/manifesto and sign the manifesto and check out all the other things we have to offer you out there. But Bruce, talk to us about the pushback you get from your fellow retiree-aged people that are like, but Bruce, I've worked my whole lifetime to be retired and check out.
Yeah, the changing the direction of a ship that has been going in one direction for 50, 60, 70 years is not easy. And so the buying into, as the Christians, as we buy into the culture, and we have worked our whole lives to be able to gratify ourselves, that is so ingrained that changing that thinking, the oxymoron of freedom to instead of freedom from is absolutely difficult. The most exciting thing to me, however, is, and as Richard Bergstrom in our interview yesterday shared, it's when someone gets it, when they follow your suggestions and they go to the retirementreformation.org and they read the manifesto and they sign it and they sit back, and that will be perhaps for many the first time that they can really breathe and go, there is more.
Yeah, a lot more.
There is more. And I am free to be able to make those choices that will lead to joy, meaning, purpose, and the fruits of the Spirit.
When you think of, I love the evangelistic potential of this, because when Christ followers start to live out retirement, when they move from retirement to reformation in their mindset and understand the freedom to do so many things, it becomes an evangelistic opportunity, because their fellow retirees who don't know Jesus yet are going to go, hey, there's something different about you and how you're experiencing retirement. What are you doing? Why is it you're always so happy and fulfilled? I mean, there's an amazing opportunity here, isn't there, Bruce?
Unbelievable opportunity. And for many, even Christians, they may have just been working because they needed to feed their family or all kinds of other reasons. And they really never have come to grips with God's call on their life. Right. This may be the first time where they say, I've heard about it, I've read about it, I thought it, but I've never connected with it. It may be the very first time to take that dramatic step into freedom in Christ and the opportunities, the challenges that gives to us.
So, Bruce, before we end the podcast today, I want people to know how they could find the manifesto on the website, and also how they can get involved a whole lot deeper with the Retirement Reformation. Why don't you give them a little bit?
Yeah, here we realize that there are many pathways that will help people to be able to realize the message of the Retirement Manifesto and the Reformation and apply it in their lives. And so when you go to retirementreformation.org, there are multiple ways for you to begin to take next steps to discover what it is that God has for you. One of those steps is to sign up for the original Rethink membership. It's free, and there are wonderful, wonderful resources there. The resources and the other levels of membership will continue to expand and to provide opportunities for you. Let me mention again the Retirement Reformation Manifesto discussion guide. Bring a couple of your neighbors, or maybe it's your kids, or maybe somebody from church together, and read through that and have the discussions about these issues. And God will then use that as a pathway for you to discover what it is that you too can say, I retire for Him, and what it actually means.
Check it out, all of it, all online, retirementreformation.org, retirementreformation.org. Bruce Bruinsma with the Retirement Reformation. Thanks for being on I Retire for Him today.
Thanks, Jim.
Check us out online, retirementreformation.org, retirementreformation.org. You've been listening to the Retirement Reformation broadcast that we call I Retire for Him, because we're trying to move people from retirement to reformation, so we can all ultimately say, I retire
for Him.
Thanks for listening to I Retire for Him with your hosts Jim and Martha Brangenberg and Retirement Reformation founder Bruce Bruinsma. I Retire for Him is the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. Most Christians tend to follow the world's pattern of rest and self-pampering during retirement. However, in your retirement, you can be focused on God's unique call to love, serve, and help others. This can be your best season of life if you take advantage of a life's worth of knowledge and experience and combine it with a greater freedom of time and money and invest it all in the generations both preceding and following you. The Retirement Reformation is encouraging Christians to find and follow God's call in all seasons and aspects of life, especially in retirement. Take time to sign the manifesto at retirementreformation.org. and explore the wealth of resources available on our site. Join this movement of God and journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Go to retirementreformation.org.